started. I'm going to pronounce my G's wrongly.
Yeah.
Something along the lines of Gert Stulp is the name of our speaker today. He's a postdoc over at LSHTM, but he's got there through a very circuitous route, I have just learned. He did his undergraduate on artificial intelligence at Groningen, which I also pronounced wrongly, in Holland. And then he went on to do a a master's in behavioural science at both Groningen and Cambridge. He then ended up doing his PhD in psychology on height and the evolutionary implications of height in modern populations. And he's not going to talk about that today. Between doing that and coming here, he also found himself in the sociology department for a bit, so he is an all-round human scientist. But he's actually going to talk a bit about evolutionary psychology today. And the title of his talk is Stone Age Minds or Ideas. So, Gert, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, I'm not an expert on anything, as you heard, but still I hope I will give you some cool stuff today. So there has been a sort of huge debate about modern human adaptiveness, and this debate was perhaps most fierce in the 90s of the previous century. And basically, it narrowed down to whether we are really sort of this Stone Age mind in a modern skull, or whether we are really just a very flexible species. And basically, has our hunter-gatherer evolutionary past made us very inflexible or very flexible? And although this debate was sort of largely confined to sort of academic circles, we actually see more and more of this sort of paleo arguments getting into sort of normal society. And one example is the barefoot running. So some have argued that we have evolved to run long distances, and obviously we have not evolved on cushioned shoes. So it is sort of a sort of intuitive appeal that we are actually better off walking in these weird shoes than on the shoes we do now. And again, it sort of makes sense. You can follow the argument, but then again, this is not the only aspect that has changed in the environment. We have a completely different lifestyle, and we have hard concrete, asphalt things which we run on. So it's not entirely obvious from the start whether we really should be running on those shoes compared to our cushioned shoes. And in fact, one of the companies selling those shoes have been sort of overselling the paleo argument a little bit too much, and saying that there was a bit too much evidence for it, and they have to sort of give money back to the people who bought these ugly shoes. And this all sort of hinges on the idea of a mismatch, right? So we have evolved, and now we are in a different environment, and we do something weird. And here's, for instance, a book by Gluckman and Hansen, Why the World No Longer Fits Our Bodies. And again, this is based on the idea of mismatch. So what is a mismatch? So, more formally, what is a mismatch? Can everyone see the blue line, I guess, hopefully? All right, so we have a changing environment, right, because of whatever reason. And the phenotype always has to change in response to that environment. So there's always a minor lag, right, because the phenotype always has to adjust to the environment. And typically it is believed that sort of evolutionary change is very slow. If something happens to the environment, if there's a drastic change in the environment, for instance, due to global warming, then the phenotype may actually not be able to sort of adapt to this environment fast enough. And this is what we call a mismatch or an evolutionary lag. And to give an example, people have studied this deer, and they found that the population was actually declining, and they wanted to know why. And they showed that because of sort of global warming, the flowering date, so sort of the date where most food was available, was actually getting early on in the year. But the problem is these animals use sort of the light during the day as a cue rather than temperature. And because of this sort of a mechanism they have evolved, they would actually come too late to the breeding grounds, or they were reproductively able to at a too late time, which is why their individual fitness declined. So really sort of this last figure is crucial. Because of that mismatch, they were sort of mismatched to the environment in an evolutionary way. And for humans, something very similar has been argued, except for that it's not global warming or some other sort of environmental change, but we believe it's mostly to do with some cultural innovations such as agriculture or the Industrial Revolution. And the argument goes like this. If 24 hours represent the 4.5 billion years of life, then the Homo only arrived on the scene about 50 seconds to midnight. And if we look at only the Homo genus, then sort of agricultural humans only arrived at the scene 5 minutes to midnight. And during most of that time, it is sort of argued in a sort of stereotypical way that we were living on the African savanna as hunter-gatherers. But what we do know is that we weren't agriculturalists or industrialists, right? And because of this, our body has evolved sort of not for the current environment. So one example is the Paleo Diet. So go paleo is a phrase coined by Geoffrey Miller, an infamous evolutionary psychologist. And basically, this diet entails that you should eat meat, bacon, weirdly, and some other stuff as well, but mostly meat. And evolutionary psychologists can be sort of have quite strong feelings about this. Glenn Geher says the Paleo Diet is straightforward and obviously right. And he starts off his article with saying that everyone who doesn't believe in the Paleo Diet must be either a creationist or have sort of fundamental problems with understanding the ideas of evolution. All right, Glenn. So again, we can say, okay, perhaps there is some diet which we were more accustomed to, but this is not the only thing that has changed in the environment. Surely, maybe a paleo diet is good if you actually run a complete marathon to your supermarket and get your food, right? Because we have this sedentary lifestyle. And also, maybe eating a lot of meat is very good if you don't want to become much older than 60 years, right? Anyway, let's delve a little bit further into this paleo diet. So we ask Glenn, okay, so what diet should we actually be eating then? And the answer is actually not very obvious. So Marlene Zook has a very nice book, and basically her whole book is about that we don't really know what happened in the paleo that well. And also that there was so much flexibility in paleo types. It's not just this African savanna hunter-gatherer idea. And if we look actually at the diets of sort of contemporary hunter-gatherers, then we see a large variation in what they actually eat. So the Inuit almost only eat meat and fish, and the Kunga are somewhat more varied, and even in Africa, sort of, we see more variation. So it is quite hard to sort of exactly pinpoint what is the perfect paleo diet, and I think a more reasonable conclusion would be that we're actually sort of evolved to be able to eat a variety of diets, right? That we're truly omnivores. And we know, of course, as some scientists also from UCL have sort of discovered that we have evolved to be able to digest milk. Well, not every one of us, but sort of some populations. And milk is clearly a no-go in the paleo diet. The most convincing thing for me about why we are not necessarily sort of adapted to only this paleo diet comes from the Human Microbiome. So this is the latest fad in medicine, so I'll jump in on that. So basically, the microbiome are all the creatures living inside of your body, and there are a lot of them, and the number of genes they have in total vastly outnumber the number of genes we have. And the beautiful thing of this microbiome is that it's very flexible, and it can adapt very quickly. And to show you something, here on the left we have, doesn't really matter what it all means, also don't try to read it. The thing is, all these different colors reflect different bacteria or different species of whatever residing in your gut. And you can clearly see that there are different proportions, but also completely different species. And these are children from Burkina Faso, and these are children from America. And they have completely different microbiomes. And the same is for Italian adults and sort of Hadza adults. Their microbiome is completely different. What's the beautiful thing of this is that they could show that the bacteria that were really sort of pronounced in, for instance, this green one, was really specific to the types of food they were eating. So really these bacteria were really sort of good at extracting the type of foods that these people were actually getting in. And this doesn't only hold for between populations, also within populations. Again, it doesn't really matter what it says, but basically if you just pick out people and look at their microbiomes, you can see whether they are meat eaters or whether they eat more pasta and stuff. And again, all those bacteria that are present really in the meat eaters, those are really bacteria that are sort of good at dealing with getting nutrients out of meat, and vice versa for carbohydrates. So last nifty example is that the Japanese population, compared to everyone else in the world, actually have bacteria in their gut that are specifically able to sort of deal with the sushi. So really sort of this sort of cultural thing of eating sushi, or ecological thing of eating sushi, really affects your microbiome. And this is also passed on to your children. So what's the whole point of this? Well, Schnorr et al. Conclude, host microbiome mutualism holds great relevance to the field of human evolution as it vastly propels the genetic landscape for adaptation well beyond somatic potential. Right? So it isn't, so maybe our body, maybe evolution is slow, and maybe our body can evolve very slowly to new diets, but our body isn't the only thing that has to evolve to the diet. There is a whole microbiome inside your gut which can evolve much quicker. And actually, it seems to be doing just that. So to say that there is one paleo diet which we are adapted to seems to be wrong, really. Okay, we can also just ask, what do the experts say? None of this scientific blah. And then they asked a lot of doctors and sort of nutrition experts to rate all the different diets, the 32 most popular diets. Paleo diet ranked number 31, not so good. You think, is there a worse diet? No, it was a shared 31st position with some other diet. Also, it's not very good for weight loss, and so on. So the paleo diet, from many reasons, does not seem to be optimal. Again, there is some plausibility to the idea that we have evolved for certain environments, and if environments change, is that we might not be perfectly fit for that environment. And we obviously have this sort of evolutionary heritage in our body, right? The tailbone is a famous example. But as we already saw with the sort of the shoes and the paleo diet, even for such sort of body functions, it's not that easy. It's just to say there is a mismatch. However, it becomes even more problematic when we start going to talk about the brain. So, from a Darwinian perspective, from sort of a simplistic Darwinian perspective, we do some crazy stuff, right? We adopt children, we abort our children, and then we complain about others aborting our children. We take the pill in our most fertile years, and then spend lots of time and energy and money to get fertile in older ages. And those don't really seem to be sort of Darwinian, even if you take less extreme examples. We do behaviors that sort of detract from baby-making business, right? So if we have such behavioral examples, this idea that our modern skull houses a Stone Age mind is very plausible. And indeed, these evolutionary psychologists say, well, why are we so mismatched? Why do we have a Stone Age mind? Well, we had this capacity for culture. We always had that. That was evolved in our brain. But for some reasons and some technological innovations, this culture gone haywire, and we are not able to adapt to that anymore. So a little bit depending on who you talk to, it's agriculture or the Industrial Revolution that's the culprit. But really, our Stone Age mind is adapted to this earlier period and not the later part. And so it's interesting that they say, like, culture, our ability for culture, is the exact reason why we are mismatched. Right? This is the reason why we are so fundamentally mismatched. While others, most notably sort of human behavioral ecologists or niche constructionists, they take the exact opposite view. They say our ability for culture or social learning is exactly why we are able to inhabit the entire world and almost all possible ecologies. And they say, well, there may be some evolutionary lag, but we are very much able to adapt to our environment. And sometimes they even go further and they say, well, look, we create our environments for our own adaptive purposes. Right, so you can see there's a fundamental distinction between evolutionary psychology and sort of other fields. Nonetheless, let us sort of try and examine these possible Stone Age minds we have in the brain, right? These sort of genetic things in the brain that make us mismatched. Well, and sort of a notable example that's often used, so I will use it as well, is obesity, right? The idea is, this is a title by Gert Stulp, another notorious evolutionary psychologist, and the title of his paper is Blame Our Evolved Gustatory Preferences, right? And you can see how unhappy he is with that milkshake. And the idea is, because we love sugar so much and fat so much, we get sort of obese. Maybe that's one reason. Another sort of mismatch reason that seems sort of a little bit more better in explaining the current rates of obesity is that the portion sizes of food has increased massively, and evolution probably didn't really make some sort of system that would curtail our food intake. It's just sort of, it's very bad at saying stop eating, you have enough. Anyway, these we know, right, from sort of introspection that this evolved taste for sugar makes some sense. I mean, it's not coincidental that Coca-Cola is known in almost every country and that so many people drink it, and that their sort of Brussels sprouts are not as companies are. And with children as well, it's easy to learn to taste sugar and not so much Brussels sprouts. But this is not the whole story, and you obviously know that, but still it bears repeating. This is a sort of a population perspective, that we are mismatched as a species because of our evolved taste for sugar. And that leads us astray. Well, the first thing to note, of course, is that, well, not everyone is obese, and there is sort of, actually, it is a sort of minor part that is obese, and there's also actually quite a large part that is underweight, which is much more difficult to explain, I guess, from the sort of perspective that we are evolved to eat sugar. And basically, most of these are German mothers, by the way. Most individuals seem to be in a range of normal weight. What normal weight means, I'll come back to. And it's even more interesting. Sort of, there is so much variation in sort of rates of obesity, and maybe it's interesting to look at that rather than just saying, look, we have evolved to eat sugar in the Pleistocene, and now that leads us astray. And again, this may also be very familiar to you, that wealthy individuals, at least in contemporary populations, seem to have lower rates of obesity than poor individuals. And that might have to do with the fact that healthier foods are more expensive. And apparently, this is from last week, there's a growing price gap. And if we look at it like this, then it's more of a sort of human behavioral ecology perspective, that maybe poor individuals are living with certain constraints, money constraints, for instance, and that makes them more likely to get obese rather than just saying, look, they like sugar. Also, we know about education. So there are quite strong gradients with education in obesity. So England is the top one here. And more educated individuals have a lower likelihood of being obese. And this may hint at some differences in social learning, or that there's some learning involved with maybe overeating or eating. Difficult to say. And let's sort of get further into that sort of idea of that it has something to do with learning. There are two studies, and they basically show that it really seems to be about some behavioral pattern that is sort of inherited, not in a genetic way, but just sort of in a cultural way. This last article, for instance, concludes that childhood obesity today seems to be largely confined to those whose same-sex parents are obese, and the link does not seem to be genetic. And this is quite important, I think, because again, if we would have stopped looking after this idea that we have an evolved taste for sugar and fat, it's not very, I mean, it wouldn't really explain a lot. It wouldn't really explain all the variation we have. And also, maybe it isn't necessarily this genetic mismatch of this evolved taste for sugar that's leading us astray. There are also plenty of opportunity for sort of developmental mismatches, right? So a child in the mother's belly already learns to acquire certain tastes, right? So what the mother eats is later sort of the food of preference for children. So there is already something going on over there. Also, the maternal sort of body has a massive influence on the metabolism of the child itself. So underweight and overweight mothers are more likely to have obese children. And then there is this aspect of learning. You might really learn that you just have to eat way too much because this is what your parents always done. Okay. This may not all be sort of very earth-shattering for you, but now we come at a sort of more important point. So what do we actually base our idea of mismatch on? Okay, why do we think that this obesity is sort of a mismatch? Right? It probably has to do with some sort of perceptions we have of health, right? Or maybe something of physical fitness. So probably obese individuals have a little bit more difficult or climbing the stairs, or are more likely to sweat a little bit with minor exercise, and maybe we base our ideas of mismatch on that. But is that really a true measure of sort of fitness? I would argue not, and I don't know how informative such sort of perceptions would be. Mostly because a recent study studying about 3 million individuals, all very well done, controls for education, income, all those kind of things, actually show that grade 1 obesity, which are BMIs between 30 and 35, overall was not associated with higher mortality, and overweight, this BMI 25 to 30, was associated with significantly lower all-cause mortality. Right? So if we now take this perspective of the whole world, right, and we see the average BMIs, then if we restrict ourselves to looking at industrialized populations, then all populations are actually between 25 and 29. So from this perspective, you could say, well, they're actually behaving very adaptively because they all have an average, well, not all individuals, of course, but all these nations have an average BMI which corresponds to lowest mortality. So from this perspective, I wouldn't go that far, of course, but I do think it is a very important point to say, okay, but what is our idea of mismatch then based on? And again, with these root years, it is very important that you somehow show that it affects fitness, or some proxy of fitness as mortality or fertility. But measuring fitness is really frowned upon within evolutionary psychology. Right? So there is a sort of distinction between human behavioral ecology and evolutionary psychology on what you should be measuring. And evolutionary psychology is really sort of frowning upon at counting babies or sort of measuring fitness idea. So here are Tooby and Kuzmides, quite some time ago, but still, that measuring fitness basically is a surprising lapse in many excellent evolutionary researchers' thought. All right, but then if we don't do that, if we don't do that work, then again, what do we base our idea of mismatch on? Is it because they look a little bit rounder than our idea of the perfect ancestral man? Is that how we determine what a mismatch is? To make the case further, most of us have an overbite, and it is believed that this is the result of eating with cutlery, right? I always thought it was sucking almonds off, but most of us are having an overbite. Yet this has no real implications for how we are able to manage our food, right? We can all perfectly eat. But this would be a sort of similar example as that with obesity. This is not how it looked in ancestral times. But would we consider this a mismatch? When would we consider this a mismatch? I think that within evolutionary psychology, they say we shouldn't be counting babies or not measuring fitness in any way. But I think that they base their mismatch on their perceptions of low fertility, for instance, or low health. So actually, I think they are doing it, but they just only do it when it sort of serves them to show that there is a mismatch. Okay, so where are we now? All right. what would be an alternative measure of fitness within sort of the evolutionary? If we are not going to look at babies, what are we then supposed to do? Well, some say then, okay, we look at the number of sex partners, right? Because the number of sex partners surely is a better measure of ancestral fitness than the number of babies, right? And to make a point that this is a sort of widely cited Peru's article who showed that wealthy men have more sex partners, but they don't have higher fertility, right? And this article is often used to say, look, modern humans are crazy. You shouldn't measure fitness because we're completely off track. Let's look a little bit deeper into this distinction between sex partners and babies. I am willing to concede that the environment has changed so much that fitness may mean something different in contemporary populations, or that at least it's a very sort of difficult topic, right? We don't have sort of kin networks in sort of more modern or reduced kin networks in modern societies. That surely affects the number of children we have. We have high education, which sort of impacts the number of children we have, and we sort of use birth control measures, which also probably affects the number of children we have. However, it seems also so obvious to me that if you don't have your parents around who frown upon your every move, or many hundreds of men and women of similar ages and state of mind, and sort of condoms, that wouldn't in any way affect your sexual behavior. So the point is, why has sort of the environment changed so much that we can't use babies, but it hasn't changed enough that we can use babies as a measure of fitness? I think sort of that's dodgy. All right, last part of my presentation. Despite all these sort of caveats I already talked about, let's find these maladaptive genetic mechanisms, right? Let's go into the brain. Let's find them. Let's see sort of if we are really mismatched because of some brain mechanism. Let's find those mechanisms. So how do we usually do that? We do that by reverse engineering. So what does this mean? Within evolutionary psychology is that we identify the proximate cause as really sort of the mechanistic cause of behavior by reference to its function by reverse engineering. Right? I'll give you an example. But before I do that, already Tinbergen, quite some time ago, already said that maybe this is not completely optimal because, as he said, there has been and still is a certain tendency to answer the causal question by merely pointing to the goal, end, or purpose of behavior, seriously hampering progress of ethology. So what he meant was that in those days, many people would say, okay, the animal attacked aggressively because it was angry, right? Because its mechanism said it was angry. And that's, of course, not a very satisfactory explanation, right? It's a little bit of a circular argument. And things like this don't happen that often, but we still see it sort of in contemporary work. For instance, here, Hazelton and colleagues hypothesized that women should be more vigilant of reproduction-compromising behaviors, such as inbreeding, during times of peak fertility than during times of low fertility. What they show is that women, when they're fertile, call their dads less, and their moms more, and their friends more, all right, than when they're not fertile. On the basis of this behavioral finding, they argue, we suspect our data reveal the operation of two different systems. One motivating females to avoid their fathers, blah, 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 and one motivating women to become more interested in high-quality mates. These may be perfectly fine, well, there's maybe okay explanation, functional explanations of sort of the actual behavior that is produced, but it tells us absolutely nothing about the existence of these mechanisms. They have actually done nothing to actually uncover those mechanisms. They've just provided a functional explanation. And this is important because a functional explanation doesn't necessarily map onto a mechanistic explanation. So here, we can combine ants and sort of robotics. What we see here are some species of ants, and there are also a lot of corpses for some reason. And what they do in some sort of self-organization way, they collect all the corpses and they pile them up, right? It's called corpse aggregation. And if you see this happening, you are sort of bound to say like, okay, well, these ants want like sort of a clean house, and then they identify all the corpses and they bring them sort of to a pile, right? And the functional explanation would be that maybe, I don't know, it's better to live in a clean house, whatever. The problem with such functional explanations, again, is it tells us nothing about how ants actually do this behavior. And to show this, come in the robots. So these are sort of our robotic ants, and they're very simple. They have only two sensors, right? Only two sensors, only two cells, and the only thing they can do is turn away depending on whether light does or does not fall on the sensor, right? So this one is programmed to, if there's something, if there's a block in front of your sensor, in front of your sensor, turn away, right? So its actual rule is to avoid blocks or corpses as viewed. And what they saw was when they actually let 3 of those robots walking around or driving around, they find exact the same pattern as with the ants before. The reason why this happened was because they didn't have a sensor in the middle of their face, so when there's a block right in front of them, they just keep on driving until they bump into this other block so they turn away. And if you ask students, okay, so what are these robots doing, right? So how have we programmed these robots to do this? Then they would come out like, well, first you have programmed them to find the closest by block, and then to identify the pile that is closest by, and then to bring it there, right? Because they want to sort of to clean the arena. So I hope you can see here that sort of the functional explanation is very, very, very far away from the mechanistic explanation. Here it's actually the opposite. Here it's the actual mechanistic rule is stay away from the blocks or drive away from the blocks rather than grab the blocks and collect it. And this mirrors sort of new ideas in artificial intelligence. Evolutionary psychologists in the 80s and 90s really sort of appealed to this idea of artificial intelligence, because back then robots were really thought of as the brain was thought of as a computer still, but and a robot, what you had to do with a robot is you had to implement all these algorithms, right? All these if and then statements. You had to sort of specify all the rules in the brain of these robots. And that's what everyone did in artificial intelligence. And that has produced sort of monumentally stupid robots. Really sort of, we are really not very advanced in our robotics. And this is a nice example. This is Honda's Asimo. It's only $1 million. And there have been hundreds of programmers trying to program his brain. And it is completely inflexible. There was this show where he was sort of supposed to climb a stair. That was actually the whole reason for the show. And then he fell down the stairs. And they don't really know why. Maybe because the stair had a different color. Maybe there was some sound around. He's completely inflexible. And this is not how actually humans or any animal work. They are not that inflexible. And this, in artificial intelligence, they call good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. And now they have gone over to sort of new-fashioned one. And what they do is sort of, they focus much more on the body, let the body do all the work, and most importantly for the brain, sort of, they just use sort of neural networks and they let it learn itself. So it's not specified by algorithmic rules, it really lets it learn by itself. And to give another example of that may be more familiar to you, in language learning, Chomsky sort of proposed that we must have this language acquisition device, right? We, as children, we don't get enough language stimuli to actually be able to sort of get all the grammar rules and all the syntactic rules, right? So this is the poverty of the stimulus argument. It's often used. And because the stimuli are impoverished, there was a need for this language acquisition device to be there, right? It's sort of, well, children cannot learn it, so there must be something innate. There must be something hardwired in the brain. But this is completely not how current linguists think about these things. In fact, they show that children are amazing statistical learners and actually do learn purely by pattern recognition of all the stimuli provided. So it's actually fairly unconstrained, and there's definitely not a thing as an innate language device. To sort of stay on the topic of the problems with reverse engineering is that, well, I'll just read out. This was published last week in Evolution and Human Behavior, and it's a fine article. It's all fine. Just a disclaimer before I start bashing it. Males occupy a larger range than females in many mammal populations, including humans, and show an advantage in certain spatial cognitive laboratory tasks. This whole parking idea. And then evolutionary psychologists have explained these patterns by arguing that an increase in spatial ability facilitated navigation, blah, 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 blah. And then they find some evidence that men in Twe and Chimba have larger visiting ranges and go more often to different cities than women, and also they are superior in their spatial navigation. And then they say these findings offer strong support for the sort of evolutionary hypothesis, that is that we have this sex-specific evolved brains, right? Now, I am fine with that being true, right? It could be that men have sort of evolved brains that are better at spatial cognition for whatever reason. I don't think this actually is strong evidence. I don't think their reverse engineering is sufficient to actually say that they provided strong evidence that there is this genetic difference. To me, it seems very plausible, and they could have even tested it, that you actually have a better spatial cognition when you walk around more. Right? It seems fairly intuitive that what stuff that you do all the time also makes you a little bit better at it. So they could have just looked at all those men and women who walk the same distances or visit sort of these cities all over the country or whatever, and to see if their spatial cognition differs. So to me, this is here sort of the, and this is what you often see. If they show any sex difference, for instance, or whatever difference, they think that there's some proof of some genetic difference, of some genetic mechanism. Well, I disagree with such ideas. To go on in this point, even things that we consider to be fundamentally genetic or sort of very innate to humans, such as social learning, imitation, and theory of mind, have sort of recently been argued that they are not as innate as we think they are. So Celia Hayes, in sort of an amazing article, says that I find that recent empirical work in comparative psychology, developmental psychology, and cognitive neuroscience provides surprisingly little evidence of genetic adaptation and ample evidence of cultural adaptation. And then the last point, and I'll stop be jabbing about this reverse engineering. The criteria for sort of to say what is in complex adaptation is also very difficult. There's often something, you know, I don't know, this George Williams stuff, it has to be complex, there needs to be a specific function, needs to be selected for. And these are all very subjective criteria. And if we would have this criteria, then for sure reading would be considered a genetic adaptation. Because reading serves a function, right? Reading sort of squibbly lines to get some information. It has profound effects on our brain, right? It completely changes our brain and also subsequent brain areas, what they do with it. And it will, again, it has a very clear function. Except we know that it is not genetic. We know that this is culturally learned. So already this example of reading should be sort of be used as an example that we should be really cautious when we conclude that something is a genetic adaptation. And how does this particularly relate to the sort of maladaptiveness and the mismatch? Again, there may be mechanisms that lead us astray, but it is far from established, I think, currently in the literature, but in general, it is very difficult to establish whether that really is some sort of Stone Age mechanism rather than a more cultural mechanism, for instance. All right, very last bit. Why should we care? I may, in fact, be preaching to the choir. Maybe you all have these ideas already. Maybe you have even more profound ideas. In that case, I've just wasted your time. And I can tell you then why I think it is important. In the 90s, there was this debate, basically what I talked about today. And many of people, also including some of us here in this room, have contributed to this debate. And I don't think we have progressed that much farther in 25 years. And perhaps some people are making the same mistakes now as they did then. And the fundamental issue seems to be flexibility. So if we have sort of some measure of flexibility of the brain, where we have on one side the genetic determinists who think that everything is genetic and from the brain, and on the other side we have maybe cultural anthropology, or those sort of who think that learning is fairly unconstrained, and evolutionary psychology really thinks the brain is rather inflexible, and human behavioral ecologists think it is quite flexible. I guess cultural evolution, somewhere in the middle, I guess. And these ideas of the brain do have fundamental result in fundamental differences in the premises of the theory. So behavioral ecology focuses more on the present, more on adaptiveness, and those type of things, while evolutionary psychology focuses on the past. They should be focusing more on the mechanisms and more about these genetic algorithms. And importantly, this evolutionary psychology has as a priori sort of dogma that there should be a mismatch. Any sort of adaptive behavior we see in current society is purely a consequence of the fact that apparently the environment hasn't changed for that specific mechanism. All right? On the other hand, behavioral ecology has as a starting point that there is no mismatch, that humans are adapted to the environment, although they are, of course, willing to concede that there may be many cases in which people do not behave adaptively, and current low fertility might be an example of that. My point, sort of the main point, is that I don't think a mismatch is a very good starting point to begin with. And for many within evolutionary psychology, they start off with this mismatch and that's it, right? We have a Stone Age mind, so we don't really need to look much beyond this. And this is sad because it prevents you from, even if there is a mismatch, it prevents you from actually getting a little bit more into how this mismatch arises. Maybe it's not simply this genetic mismatch in the brain or this genetic mechanism. Maybe it is a developmental mismatch, or maybe it's a learning mismatch. Also, what I touched upon before, if you have this view, then you think that measuring fertility and measuring fitness is sort of useless. While I think that documenting sort of all the possible environments we live in to see whether we are adaptive in those environments or not actually gives us a lot of information about the constraints on human nature. So I actually do think it gives us a lot of information. Also, if we're not measuring fitness, what other measures should we be using? That's not obvious. And the last thing is that if you are using this mismatch as a starting point and you really believe in the Stone Age mind, then I think you are denying the fundamental ways in which culture influences the brain. Surely we have a brain wired for culture, and we make culture, but similarly culture also influences our brain a lot, like in the example of reading. So we are in anthropology, so I thought let's end with some anthropologists. Maybe you have heard of him. He's from UCL. He said that it is essential that we not base our image of ourselves on false foundations. What is involved here is not simply the understanding of human nature, but also the image of humanity that grows out of that understanding. And I completely agree. And I think that if we base our understanding on this false notion of mismatch and Stone Age mind, then let's take an example of sort of sex differences. If we really, without actually delving into the matter, just say that men and women are different because of some sort of genetic difference between them, which is a result of their Stone Age past, then because humans are a reflexive species, they are going to use that information and actually act more like they were from the Stone Age. So on that sort of cultural anthropology note, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.